All right, welcome to another episode of How Do We Solve It? I'm your host, Dan Johnson, Executive Director of the Institute for Community Solutions, and this is the podcast that helps you address the most pressing problems in your community. We interview nonprofits and experts around the country to talk about how to address these problems. So if you're interested, tell your friends to watch and subscribe to the How Do We Solve It podcast on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and wherever podcasts are sold. All right. So rolling into today's show, this is a very exciting show because this is the kickoff of our community justice series. The Institute for Community Solutions has been looking into the challenges that communities have faced with their justice systems over the past 2 years. And we found some pretty shocking statistics. Things like the first year recidivism rate for the United States is 44%. That's in the first year that 44% of those convicted of a crime will commit another. If you ratchet that up to about 7 or 8 years, it gets closer to 80%. If the justice system is supposed to be helping people resolve disputes and repair harms, and at the end, there's supposed to be a resolution, it's not delivering it. The promise of a speedy trial is that you should be able to get a quick resolution to your problem in our courts. And yet, the average wait for a justice or a case in this country is about 5 months, and that's just for a plea deal, not to mention actually getting a trial and a jury. And in that time, the victim waits for justice, and the offender may have effects like not being able to drive to where they want to go, or maybe even losing their job because of the restrictions placed on them pre-trial. And of course, this leads to while our institutions aren't particularly trusted, the courts have a special place with only 30% of the American public actually trusting the courts to be fair and objective and actually deliver justice. There's a crisis for an institution that relies on the trust in the institution to do its job. Alexander Hamilton said the courts have neither the power of the sword nor of the purse. They simply have trust. And they don't have that with the American people. And since Trayvon Martin's shooting in Florida, there's been a lot of focus on reforms in the justice system. But one reform that has really not been looked at is community solutions to justice. There are almost 200 nonprofits around the country today that help people resolve harms and repair disputes outside of the justice system. And while there are limitations to these community solutions to justice, they may not deal with murder or really high-level theft cases or things like that. And they may find it difficult to deal with cases where one of the parties just wants revenge instead of a resolution. These organizations handle about 600,000 cases per year and have shown off incredible data on lower recidivism rates, on reduced wait times, and really on an overall increase in the perception from both sides of this system being fair. And today I have the pleasure of talking with one of those organizations, which is the Restorative Justice Mediation Program. I always say project, and I think I got it right this time. It is the program, right?
Yes.
Fantastic. I have Ian Ragsdale and Xiani Williams. I think I got that right.
Xiani, yes.
Xiani. I have Ian Ragsdale and Xiani Williams from the Restorative Justice Mediation Program. Super happy to have you guys on How Do We Solve It? Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Awesome. So talk to us a little bit about how you got into this work in the first place. I mean, this is especially outside the justice system where most people don't even think there is anything. How did you guys get involved in this kind of work as individuals?
Okay. I'll go first. I went to law school with the kind of pre-intention of becoming a mediator, getting involved in ADR. And I took the civil litigation.
Which for our audience is alternative dispute resolution.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Alternative dispute resolution, which is mediation, arbitration, even pre-mediation settlement conferences kind of fall into that category. I was really intrigued by that after working in a previous industry where I got an opportunity to witness mediation in practice and see how quickly it could resolve disputes and get things back on track in a business sense. But in law school, I participated in a human rights program where I started to learn a little bit about the mass incarceration problem that we have here in the United States and the school to prison pipeline. And so when I graduated, I was looking for a program that I could do pro bono work in as a mediator and utilize my law degree in a way that could give back to the community and impact that school to prison pipeline. So I found this program, which was started here in San Diego County in 1993 by a woman named Pearl Hartz, who was a retired Mennonite minister. And she just started off by trying to help people in her own community resolve disputes. And when the victim offender reconciliation programs, or VORP programs, really came about in the late 80s, early 90s, here in California, she started one here in San Diego. So we are officially the San Diego, the Victim Offender Reconciliation Program of San Diego County, Inc. And that's how we were created. And when I came around about 9 years ago, we were predominantly involved in juvenile crimes, low-level juvenile crimes with restitution, like vandalism and theft and things like that. And over the years, we've continued to expand. And we brought Xiani on in 2019. And I'll let her share a little bit about her journey, but we were really looking to reach more Spanish speakers. We changed our location in San Diego County around that time. And we brought her on to really kind of like update our curriculum. And you want to share a little bit about your background as well?
So
Yeah.
before she hops in, I'm really curious about the Mennonite background of
Mhm.
RJMP. Like I'm not sure what your religious affiliation is, but uh, what drove? Because I understand victim offender reconciliation kind of really came out of the Mennonite community in a lot
Yeah.
of ways. So what made them decide, or Pearl in this case, decide to create programs like that as opposed to just sending people through the traditional justice system?
Yeah. Well, you know, the Mennonite communities, as far as, and I'm not a person of Mennonite background, so this is my best understanding. But um, around that time, late 70s, early 80s, in the Midwest, Indiana, Illinois, places like that, that had Mennonite communities. They were relatively closed communities, right? So not unlike the Maori people in New Zealand that have the Council of Grandmothers, they tried to handle a lot of things internally.
Mm.
But there was a particular case where two young men became imbibed after a night of celebration, and I think they destroyed like over 30 mailboxes in their neighborhood, like ran them over with their truck.
That
And
is a heck of a night of celebration.
yeah. And so, you know, even though the Mennonite community was relatively closed, the sheriff was called, and these young men um, did have to address this pretty destructive crime, at least. My understanding was that they kind of took the community's values into perspective of managing, you know, disputes internally, and they had these young men like go to the door of each one of the people who they harmed and see if they could make it right, rebuild their mailbox or something like that. So
Mm.
I think that story is probably one of many, but it's an example of why that community, which was very closed off, embraced this type of a way of addressing harms within the community. So it's not really unsurprising that people from that community supported this VORP concept in the late 80s, early 90s, and started thinking, well, maybe the best person to address a harm that's happened to a victim is the person who caused the harm. And
Mhm.
maybe the victim is the best person to answer the question of what would make this right. And so that's really the roots of where our program came from.
That's a
And
that's a really fascinating concept, and that's certainly something we saw in the research. Is that the original reason that the state was kind of put in play instead of the victim was essentially family feuds. So you'd have one family, and then a different family either steals from or murders a member of their family, and then that family is like, well, okay, screw you guys, we're going to go over and murder a member of your family, and then you have this long-standing family feud because it was one family versus another. And so the idea was, well, we if we place the state representing the people in there to mediate this process between these two adversarial parties, then we'll get better outcomes. But certainly we've seen in the justice system that that doesn't always lead to the best outcomes. So what is different about having the victim be at the center of the reconciliation, if you will, or the restoration, and how does that change the outcome of the case? Because you'd think in some cases victims just want they're angry. I mean, in my case, I had a attempted home invasion. It wasn't attempted; they made it in my house. It was a real home invasion. Home invasion. They made it in the house. They fired a gun at me. They made it out of the house. And on one hand, I wanted answers, but on the other hand, I wanted somebody held accountable. So, how does placing the victim in the middle of that affect the outcome of the case?
Um, I would say, kind of going back to what the Mennonites looked at too, is that they saw the conflict as a harm to a relationship. Someone you knew, whether it was a community that you belonged to or someone that you actually personally knew. And so I think something that restorative justice does, it brings it back to that concept of reintegrating not just the offender, but the victim to that community and repairing that relationship that the offender and the victim have with the community, and helping the victim feel part of that community again, whether that means actually feeling safe or getting to know what's going on in their community that it's causing crime to happen or it's causing harm. And so I think putting the victim at the center and the offender as part of this process really makes it more personal, and it allows them to really dig into more of that relationship side of crime rather than personal side of just looking at it as in this something that happened to someone that needs to be punished.
yeah,
Mm,
I think that we also, as a society, we tend to kind of like demonize criminals or hold them up to some like scary, unrelatable character attributes, which you can only really do at a distance. And so a lot of times that plays into a crime victim's feeling of fear around the person who committed the crime. And oftentimes, in an encounter through restorative justice type mediation, victim offender dialogue, they might realize that the person who committed the crime is not as scary or as intimidating as they once believed them to be, which I think also takes away from some of that fear and eases the
Mhm.
reintegration into their community. And whether that's just the way you feel getting out of your car, going to the grocery store, at a gas pump, or whether you double check your locks at night, all of those anxieties kind of linger. And so oftentimes meeting the person who committed the crime, finding out why, and finding out some humanizing information about them might alleviate some of those fears.
Yeah, I think restorative processes really allow people to connect on a human level, and it allows them to leave a little bit of those labels that we put as society and some of the stigmas that are carried with that. As an offender and also as a victim, as someone that is going to be victimized and that needs to have fear or that needs to be scared.
So, how does this actually work? If I'm, say, victimized by, what type of crime am I victimized by? And how does it actually work? Where, maybe I'm in a position where I want to know more. I've heard this a lot from restorative justice organizations. Is like one of the biggest benefits the victim gets is they know more about why the person committed the act. And so, Whereas in my case, every time a car door slams or a door slams or something like that, I'm like jump a little bit because I don't know where it's coming from. In some of these cases, maybe that's not how it ends up. So, can you talk a little bit about the process and maybe give an example for us to compare? Obviously, confidential stuff from names and things like that, but give an example of what could have been gone through the traditional justice system, but went through the restorative process and had a better outcome.
Okay. So I think one thing to understand is depending on where you are, they may implement the restorative justice process in several different ways. So we have completely non-judicial implementation, which would be a community response to a harm. And this could be anything from, a family dialogue to an intervention to a privately held mediation regarding a sexual assault or something like private in nature that occurred between two people. Then
Or
we
an
can,
elder council in a
yeah,
community,
yeah.
things like that.
So those are kind of the non-judicial routes. When we're talking about a judicial case or a case for which somebody may or may not be culpable of a criminal crime or a crime in the eyes of the state, or criminal act, we would have pre-charge, which means that rather than being charged by the district attorney and have a petition filed and the case being entered into court, it's entered into a restorative justice process, which in our case would look like a mediation with two private meetings prior to an actual mediation, whether it's live or on Zoom or in private caucus. We would meet individually with both participants, let them share with us their experience and their perspective on what took place. And then we would determine whether or not they're in a good place to meet with one another or to address this through the restorative justice process. And that just means that we can't have people re-traumatize either the victim or the offender by the process if either person is not emotionally ready. So that's the process regardless. But if we're pre-charged, then that person would not be charged unless they violate the restorative agreement or refuse to meet with the person to discuss what happened.
It is essentially an alternative to going through the court process. Like the court makes a referral and they're allowing for a victim offender dialogue to happen in place of the court process to see if they could reach an agreement and potentially the case could get dismissed.
And then pre-adjudication would be they have filed a petition and then maybe some facts come to light that concern either the public defender or the DA regarding the relationship between the parties. Maybe they're cousins or they're partners, or there's some other existing relationship. They go to school together. They're going to see each other every day after this takes place. And they might say, okay, well, we're willing to consider, even though this person's charged, deferring the adjudication for some sort of restorative process to take place. In that case, usually we see some sort of short-term probation that's tied to
maybe informal probation
tied to the restorative agreement, but they're still kind of in a position where they have to complete the agreed upon I guess conditions that they agree with the victim about before the charge is considered adjudicated. And then we have a post adjudication. So it could be our victim offender dialogues that take place in prisons here in California, which have been the subject of a few different mini series and other content that you can watch. But those dialogues are not mediation at all. Those people may or may not ever be released from prison, but the surviving family member or somebody who was harmed by them may want to meet with them anyway in prison. And we do cases like that every year as part of a wider statewide program. And the goal is really just, I guess, reconciliation,
to give them a
closure.
space,
Yeah.
just give them a space to express whatever that they've been holding on to, whether it's the offender, or and also give the victim an opportunity to ask questions. You mentioned sometimes that part of healing that they need is just to have an answer to certain questions that may make them feel better, like knowing that they didn't break into their home because they were specifically targeted. Maybe it was just opportunistic, and maybe their door was open. That kind of thing. That could really alleviate some of those ongoing thoughts that someone might be having in terms of the fear and the harm that was caused to them.
Those cases don't officially affect somebody's parole, but we certainly believe that parole boards should be allowed to consider whether or not the person sitting across the table from them has made attempts to reconcile with the person who was harmed, or the surviving family members of the person that was harmed. And in some instances, in our circles, we've seen actually people advocate for the release of the person who murdered their family member because they have a now existing relationship with them. And so I think that it's never too late. It's always ideal to have a pre-charge program or a pre-adjudication program, but it's really never too late to create the kind of positive and transformational impact that encountering one's victim has on the person who actually caused the harm. And I think that's where we start to see that impact on recidivism rates, and we start to see the effect of transitioning from when you cause harm in the community, it just being a nameless, faceless mark, to like somebody with a story that's a person that has a background like you, that can maybe hear some of the harms you've experienced and the traumas you've experienced as the person causing harm, and relate to that. So it's really an incredible process to watch, and I think the statistics really speak for themselves. And we even see that halfway houses here in San Diego, where people are released from prison, that implement restorative justice programming as part of their reintegration in the community, are also seeing lower recidivism numbers than the averages. And so that kind of retrospective or introspective impact of knowing what victims' experiences are is a really good empathy development tool.
Yeah, and something we hear often is this process too soft on crime, or is it too soft on the person who caused the harm? And I would say that it really isn't. It's a lot harder to face someone personally and actually hear from them how you've affected them, how your actions are really having a long-lasting impact, even in ways that maybe you didn't imagine. So it can make a much bigger impact than going through more of an impersonal process where someone is telling you what you need to do, what your punishment is. And I think it really creates an opportunity for transformation in that person that has caused the harm.
So can you give an example that kind of illustrates how this process leads to these lower recidivism rates that we're seeing, and these, potentially safer communities? What does this process actually looks like? What's a good example?
Yes. Ooh, we have a lot of examples.
Yeah, I would say the simplest and but highly impactful process that we've seen is the direct service as part of a restorative agreement. So we have like maybe vandalism, property destruction. Oftentimes it's like kids break into schools and mess up the school at night, or churches and mess up the church at night. Like things that kids do that are destructive. Oftentimes that cycle continues until they realize the destruction. So the direct service of going and cleaning up and making right what you've done, and also hearing from the people who were impacted by it, even as simple as hearing from the janitor what his day was like when he got there and there was glass all over the whole school, and why he was concerned, right? So those kind of crimes that we would not see as really serious as adults, they really do impact the school to prison pipeline in a big way. So those juveniles that that go into lockup before they're 18 for crimes like that, crimes as simple as that, they're 87.5% more likely to be incarcerated as an adult. So we have to think about, whether those types of lockups for crimes like that actually condition people to a criminal lifestyle, and that we may be causing more harm than good. But we can see that the impact of direct service and being directly responsible for making right that harm has a really good impact. We see high graduation rates in our long-term surveys from kids that are involved in issues like that. On more serious crimes, I would say they're really centered around the victim and what their needs are. And so we approach each case really looking at, what do you need from this if you've been physically harmed, if you've been defrauded, if you've been, trafficked and used it, like whatever happened to you, what's the best way we can make this right for you? And that's how we as mediators approach the case, because we really see ourselves as a neutral party. And even though we want to see these positive impacts on the criminal justice system and on victims and on the justice involved population, we also want to know in each case what's actually going to make it right. And the victim is the best person to tell us that. So you can maybe give some examples of approaches that we've used that are unique for victims.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of quite a few cases where what you were asking is just especially for youth, where they may not understand what the impact that what they did has on people. They may just see as like, oh, it's just, a TV I broke, it was just a classroom I broke into. I can think of a case that that really surprised me, that really showed a transformation from both sides. Is we had some teenagers just break into a classroom in an elementary school, and they caused a lot of damage. And during the mediation, we had the principal and we had a teacher participate, and the teacher actually shared uh, some statements from the kids. These were, I believe, fifth or sixth grade, about just being sad and having fears that their safe space was destroyed. And I don't think that the youth that caused the harm really expected that, or even thought about, oh, when I'm doing this, I'm actually destroying a fifth grader's safe space to come to school. And then on the other hand, too, just having them share a little bit of the struggles that they were dealing with at home really helped also the school, because they were actually previous students, understand that some of these kids are just not acting out uh, because they want to act out, that there's a lot going on in their lives. And I think it really allowed them to give them a little bit more support. And it was cool to see, because part of that agreement was going back and repairing some of those damages. And also part of the agreement was also a educational component, where they had to have a certain, they had to pass their classes, they have to have a certain GPA. But on the school side, that they also had a responsibility to support them. So that was very cool. Again, these type of processes put responsibility not just on the person that caused the harm, but also on the communities, like, and how can we support them so that this doesn't happen again? Which I think is what really makes a difference in recidivism: feeling supported and not feeling alienated, and just having a collective agreement that lifts people up and empowers them to do the right thing.
It's not like you're on the outside of our society and you have to fight to get back in. It's you made a mistake and we're here to support you in correcting that mistake.
Exactly. Yes, that's the way I see it. Instead of saying, in this case, like, we're just going to, kick you out of school. What about we look at things that you may be able to do for us, and then how can we support you, and in order for you to thrive?
Mm. And you guys have if I remember right from the study, you guys have a right around an 80%. So they do these contracts, if I understand it right. So they sit together in the mediation, and then who draws up the contract? Is that you guys? Is that them? How does that work for deciding what the ultimate restitution is?
So it's structured in a way that we recognize the harm, we look at what's needed to repair the harm, and then we talk about the future intentions of the parties. All three of those sections of our agreement, so to speak, are the result of discussion between the person who caused the harm and the person who was harmed. So that's why the agreements are not really standardized in any other way other than their structure. And oftentimes the solutions to the issues that we encounter during the case, such as maybe food insecurity in a teenager that caused them to burglarize a home or something like that, are addressed organically in that agreement. So an example is a youth was offered to do direct service for the victim of a burglary, and expressed his future intention of wanting to join the military. But his current situation meant that he was struggling to survive and have enough to eat and have a roof over his head. So the victim actually, after he completed the service for his company, gave him a job for the summer, so he could get on his feet and enlist in the military. We did not, that was not part of the agreement. That was not an expected outcome of the case. It was just something that happened once we created a relationship between the two parties, and it extended beyond the agreed direct service, and we've seen that happen several times. So the reintegration is really only catalyzed by that agreement, and I think that the participation in that agreement kind of has its own effect that seems to carry the restorative aspect of the agreement. And we have actually over 90% completion rate of the agreements. Yeah.
And going back to a little bit of what Ian was saying regarding just really hearing what the victim wants, you'd be surprised sometimes it's not about like the money, or it's not about the crime itself. It really is just about, again, hearing from them or trying to understand the person that has caused them harm. So during the mediations, everything really is driven by the parties. We don't suggest any agreement terms or anything. We just kind of prompt that for them. We typically approach it with the victim. I ask things like what's important to you, what matters to you. A lot of the times they tell me, hey, I volunteer for the food bank, and I would really like if the person that caused me harm would come and see what other people are struggling with and would help in the food bank as well. So you'd be surprised. A lot of the times what is important to them is maybe not what we automatically think about. So it's really important to give them that space, and sometimes they don't know. During the pre-meetings, we ask them what they like to get out of this process, and what they'll like to see the other person do, and they may not have an idea, but that's what mediators are there for as well, is to just help them sort of go through that, ask them questions about what matters to them, what's important, and mostly also what the future intentions, what they would like to see this person do moving forward. And that typically helps a lot with coming up with ways that we can with things we can put in the agreement for both parties.
Are most victims, when you talk to them, are they angry? Are they confused? Are they, because you have this law and order vision of the justice system where the victim is just like, let them burn in hell for 1,000 years, and this is what I want. Is that typically where they're coming from? And then if so, this is kind of a collaborative process. So how do you get them to say, yeah, this is actually a process I want to participate in?
So all of the above. I mean, victims have all feelings, right? But I think what really helps is when I explain this process, people really like to hear that they are going to have an opportunity to really talk about how this has affected them. And then not just the victims, but support people, right? Anybody that has been supporting them through any process they've been going through after this happened to them. also have an opportunity to talk about how this has affected them. And then also they have an opportunity to ask questions, which is not typically something that's afforded by the court, at least not until there's like a trial and there's a victim statement or a parole hearing. So I would say that typically that is something that when people are hesitant to participate in this process, when we talk about that, they tend to really start opening up to participating. They really like having that opportunity and just feeling like their voice has been heard, rather than just not having any say to what's going to happen with the person that harmed them.
Yeah, and I feel like their emotions are going to burn hottest during the pre-mediation consultation, the pre-meetings as we call them. And it's because we're really trying to create a safe space for them to tell us that they're upset, that what their concerns are, what their fears are, what makes them the most angry. And in doing that and giving them that space, which they may receive that space if a case goes to trial. But most of the time, victims are not part of the process of plea deals that ends most people up behind bars. So a lot of times they're not being given that opportunity, as Xiani said, to voice how they feel. And in the pre-meetings, we allow them to do that. And in some types of cases, we might give them 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 pre-meetings to get through emotionally where they need to be to get involved in a direct meeting with the person who caused the harm. So yeah, we as mediators we allow people that space, and I think it's something that we're used to, is allowing those emotions to boil over, because it's something that's needed, I think, sometimes for people to sort out how they really feel. They just need to be heard.
Yeah, and something I've realized over the years as well is that success for these programs is not just measured in going through the process and having an agreement and having the agreement completed. Sometimes success means that we just gave the person that was harmed a space to voice what's going on with them. And sometimes that's all they need. Sometimes we meet with them, especially in maybe more serious cases where there's sexual harm, or in cases where the person that caused the harm doesn't admit any accountability, doesn't take any accountability. We still see a change in the person that was harmed when they are just allowed to have someone hear them. They are grateful that someone is asking them how this has affected them, that someone is providing resources for them for whatever it is that they're needing. And I would call that a success too. And sometimes that's all they need. And sometimes they even tell me, I don't need to move forward. This is all I needed. Thank you. I needed someone to truly hear me. And I needed a space to just voice what I'm feeling. And I would say that's also a success, just having that restorative process for them.
And what about the offender side? So, victims might be going through a lot of emotions, but there's not a lot of light shed on what offenders look at. Obviously, for a lot of them, there's an element of, well, I don't probably have to have a criminal record if I go through this process, depending on the process. I'm not sure where you guys are at on that. But like, where is the offender at after, they've at least gotten to the point where the system is kind of threatening to take them in, and then they're diverted to you guys?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think that this process also gives them an opportunity to have um, just some kind of control over what is happening to them. I think Ian says, well, he says it better, but a lot of youth or people feel like life is happening to them and that there's just really nothing they can do about that. And so this process just gives them an opportunity to take accountability and to also voice what is going on with them. Sometimes the cases are not black and white. Sometimes there's a lot more going on. And we're able to give the offender that opportunity to voice that. And then again, also the people that are around them, because this process, going through a criminal process, is traumatic for the offender, for the parents, for the support people that are around them, and they certainly don't get time to voice what they've been feeling or what they've been going through. So they can also do that through this process.
Yeah, I think that there is a little bit of a lack of accountability to sitting in jail because you've committed a crime against the state. And like nobody feels sorry for the state. The state's had a lot of crimes committed against it, right? And so there is a little bit of a laissez-faire attitude about why you ended up in jail, just that you are there and you're doing your time, right? So being accountable to a person, even though it might look from the outside to be a lot less, I guess, invasive on your life than being thrown in jail, it provides something that a lot of times people who are just bouncing through life, who grew up in a traumatic environment and are just responding or really reacting to what happens around them versus responding, and some of those reactions end them up in jail. They're not often given an opportunity to take a look at why, and that somebody actually cares whether I do something to change that, makes a big difference in their life. And that's just accountability. And so accountability sounds like responsibility. It sounds terrible, but people crave it in a way. Like, people crave like somebody to be responsible to or to report back to. And it's like it's part of our just innate approval seeking behavior that somehow locking people up just really doesn't trigger that for them, versus like having them accountable to an actual human being who they harmed, whose life has been changed by their actions. It tends to, I guess, wake that sense of responsibility up in people, and definitely not everybody. So I don't want to like,
Generalize.
yeah, I don't want to advertise this as some sort of one size fits all approach to crime, because there are a lot of people out there who are, they're dangerous. They have mental health issues that make them dangerous. That we see. There's probably not an alternative that our society has for them to incarceration. But for many people, it's life choices, like poor life choices, that end them up in incarceration for short or even long stays. And for all those people who are capable of like really analyzing their behavior, this is an opportunity for them to make a change. So
Yeah, and I think one other thing really that it makes me think about why this process is effective for people to change is because nobody likes to be told what to do. You are a lot less likely to follow through with something that was imposed on you rather than something that you had a say in and that truly came from your heart, right? Saying, okay, this is what I can do for you and I truly feel like I'm capable of doing this. And so people are more likely to follow through with something that they themselves proposed rather than something that was imposed on them. But yeah, like Ian said, it is important to recognize that an essential part of restorative justice and for this to even work is that people that have caused harm do need to take some level of accountability. I mean, in fact, that is one of our few requirements in terms of our ability to do this process with people is that they need to be able to talk about it and be able to admit the harm.
And about what percent roughly of the of offenders will take accountability? I know that's really broad, but I'm like thinking from the perspective of a county commissioner who's sitting on, a criminal justice commission, and they're looking at, how can we reduce the recidivism rate here? How can we make people happier with the justice system here? How can we have a safer community? And they're wondering kind of what the limits are to this. Can you talk a little bit about those limitations, areas where it may not work as well, and give us an idea? Particularly, I'm really curious if you guys have an idea of roughly what percent of offenders are willing to take accountability, and is it 50%? Is it 70? Is it 20? What are we looking at as far
but
as the offender
I
side?
think you have to look at gang involvement to really,
Yeah.
parse that out,
Mm,
because for a lot of people that commit crimes, there are other repercussions, or there is a cost, to admitting their involvement in certain types of organized criminal activities. If you want to take juveniles, I would say there's a very, very small percentage that will hold on to their, 100% vehement denial of involvement through a process like this. Maybe 1 to 2%. I think that it's different for police who are, pursuing a charge, but once someone's been charged and they're looking at this as an alternative to something else, I think that's usually not the big question of whether or not they're accountable, right?
I think it's really hard to know, simply because the majority of people are just not even given the opportunity to be able to take accountability. I mean, when you go through the court process, I would say obviously your attorneys tell you like don't say anything.
Mhm.
And so I would say that it's hard to measure that, because if you're going through the punitive process and not given an opportunity to admit harm, or the system's not set up for you to be able to do that without causing you more harm, I don't think that we can like necessarily measure that. That would be my thought.
Yeah, I think we've had very few number of cases out of, say, like maybe just under 400 where the youth or person involved was very, very adamant that they did not do this. And in a couple of those cases, it actually turned up some really surprising results that they actually were not
Hmm.
culpable of the crime, and that maybe the person accusing them was actually culpable of a crime. So, and yeah, I want to say that that really is for people that have already been arrested or have already been charged, or are facing a pre-charge opportunity, because I think the police deal with a totally different dynamic than we do when it comes to
Of course. Yeah.
actually, apprehending someone or getting them to admit to something that took place. And we really have very little visibility into that other than the police report, which are often not exactly correct, and people are not telling the truth to the police as they're writing the report at the crime scene, and we find that out as well.
It's
um,
it's it's almost really interesting because if you're sitting down doing a police interview, there's consequences to you admitting any involvement in anything.
mhm,
But if they're sitting down with you, those consequences have kind of already been passed down, or at the very least shown to them, and
mhm.
so there's less of a intense pressure to not admit it at that point.
Yeah, and if you look at the plea
Yeah.
bargaining process, I mean, even if they went through the traditional justice system, at that point, they have very little choice as to what the prosecutor
It's true.
offers them. And so I think the biggest accountability issues we've seen are with sexual harms, consent issues, and sexual assault, like dating sexual assault and things like that. I would say that's the biggest number of offenders that
Have gone through programs.
and seem incapable of still
Mm.
seeing where they
Yeah.
caused harm. So
Another thing I've seen is where cases where the youth are willing to take accountability, but the parents are not allowing them to do that. So
Mm.
maybe they're in denial, or
mm,
maybe, yeah, I'm not sure. I can't speak for their thought process, but it has been common where the youth is willing to go through this process. They're willing to grow, admit accountability, and the parent is just simply not letting them do that. And that is honestly really disappointing to see, because it can really hinder their process of, just if they're not held accountable, they're probably not going to understand their consequences, and they're probably going to reoffend. So
it's not a
So
metric that we measure, but what she just mentioned is actually the most consistently worst outcomes that we've seen are with youth or young adults who the parent or guardian makes excuses for their behavior. We've seen, you
mhm.
know, I since we don't track that, I can't give you like a statistic, but there's a very, very high probability of them ending up incarcerated if their
Mm.
parent behaves that way after they are arrested for a crime.
And
So,
it's also very likely that the victim is not going to be able to connect with them, or that they're not going to be willing to give some leeway, or I want to say wants to like really work out something with them, because they just don't want to hear excuses, right?
Mm.
So yeah,
Right.
unfortunately, that is something that we've seen.
So, talk about the response of law enforcement and court authorities, because on some level, you need their involvement, even if you're taking cases off their hands. You need their involvement on some level because I assume you guys don't have your own police force. So, if that's not the case, what's been the response to your efforts in San Diego by the county and the county DA and the sheriffs and police departments?
so I think now you're putting me on the spot because I do have to continue to work with every agency in San Diego, after this point, and the buy-in from stakeholders for anybody considering implementing a program like this is going to be the most important. I would say here in San Diego County, the most consistent buy-in that we've had over the years since we've been around for 30 years has been the public defenders. So public defenders are oftentimes the ones getting the real story of what happened, because they're really good at sniffing out, like, somebody who's just saying, oh, I didn't do it, I didn't do it. And then they're like, well, that's not helpful to me. I can't help defend you if you're not honest with me, right? So oftentimes in that discourse, they become aware of complicated factors that led to the actual harm that took place, right? So they've been our most consistent advocates. I would say it's seasonal with prosecutors, because one thing that everybody who's trying to implement an RJ program needs to be aware of is that um, the stakeholders in a given system, if they become in control of the RJ process, they're going to try their best to make it look like the existing system. And so I think that's what we've seen here in San Diego County, is that the kind of newest, I guess, restorative justice approach is, really just a rebranded approach of juvenile prosecution. And so there are some communities where I think they've really made an effort to make the restorative justice courts look a lot different than the traditional court system. But in our case, some of those efforts on the prosecutor side have really been indistinguishable from the outsider's perspective from the traditional punitive justice system. So I think that that's one of the drawbacks is
It doesn't help the trust, as you mentioned earlier. Like, people don't have a lot of trust in the criminal justice system, especially certain communities. So when it looks like that, it doesn't matter how you frame it or how you explain it. You do wonder what messaging they're getting, that they're not willing to even go through that process, or they're not willing to consider it.
So community-based organizations are able to maintain that, integrity in the eyes of the community, usually for a longer period of time or more consistently. But we all face the same issues of, we don't have the budgets to market what we do. So not everyone is aware of the availability. And we don't have the ability to mandate certain types of programs be offered to victims. So we're at the mercy of prosecutors and people who are in communication with the victims to even let them know that programs exist. And I think that, that kind of leads into what Xiani and her team have been doing more recently, which is a lot more outreach and just educating the community about our programs and helping those different groups of stakeholders to understand exactly what it is that we do, because they might want to take advantage of it and just not know it exists.
Yes. I mean, although in the past 5 years, I have seen an increase in buying from stakeholders, even people that have been working in the system, whether it's prisons or as prosecutors. I am optimistic because I do feel like I have seen more buying, or at the very least more interest in actually learning how this process works. But the truth is, it is a constant struggle of educating people, of, again, having that, dealing with that, um, just problem of people, like, do they know about this, if the prosecutors are aware, and then also just the fact that they have a lot of discretion on whether people have access to this process or not. So I think community buying is extremely important, and community awareness. We had cases where people ask for this. They ask the prosecutor, I want to be able to meet the person that harmed me. And I think that is really truly what's going to make a difference in the long run. If people are asking for this, then they'll probably be more willing to refer the cases.
So yeah, let's dive into that in the last little bit here and get into, if somebody wanted to start something similar to restorative justice mediation program in their community. Part of our role is highlighting these programs that work so that other communities can experience some of the same impact that you guys have been able to bring in San Diego. So can you talk a little bit about, what your advice would be to someone who wanted to start something? Where do you start? What are the key things you need to do? And you already talked about maybe a couple of the potholes. Things like you want to make sure you have a lot of outreach. Things like you want to make sure that you get stakeholders on board. But talk a little bit about the process of actually starting something like this, since you guys have been doing it for 30 years.
Yeah. Okay. So every new program usually starts with an opportunity, a relationship somewhere, a listening ear, somebody who's willing to hear us out and say, okay, well, I think maybe we could do something. I would say my biggest advice is start with the low hanging fruit. There's going to be certain types of cases or situations that maybe the DA or the public defender, or even your probation department, who might even already take volunteers, is dealing with. And I think having some sort of listening session with some or all of those stakeholders to hear about, okay, what are the types of cases that you're dismissing, but you don't think you should dismiss it because like that might lead to a worse crime later? Or what are the cases that you're sending kids to juvenile hall, but you feel like maybe that's not the best answer for them, exposing them to, and kind of look for those fringe examples or edge cases. Just like when you're developing any tool, you kind of need to know what those edge cases are, right? And so I think being willing to help as an organization, your local stakeholders with those edge cases is going to be the easiest thing to address first. And they may internally come up with their own ideas of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And you might be required to operate in those parameters, but then we've helped train other areas where we've helped train other nonprofits that are serving in other counties, where they come back to us and say, oh, well, now they're sending us all these cases and we don't know what to do with it. So there's no way to predict the response, but I think to start with something that is, that they can compartmentalize, that they can manage and say, okay, we might be willing to let these cases go through restorative justice. Just be willing to start small and be very, very careful about the facilitators. Train and hire people that you can trust to help maintain your organization's integrity when they're out in the community. If we're out there saying we're neutral, we need to be very neutral to everybody that we encounter with. So it's really hard because some people are drawn to this work because of a bias towards one idea or another, and having them become facilitators where they're required to take all sides into consideration can be a challenge. So finding the right volunteers, I think, and then maintaining those relationships with volunteers whether the case volume is high or low, maintaining their training opportunity is really important.
I definitely agree. And I would also add that in reality, the easier you make it for the stakeholders, the more likely they are that they're going to be willing to try out your program. So just whatever barriers come up, you might have to just eliminate them and perhaps even offer the program without funding at first to get some buy-in before things grow. And like Ian said, I think it really, the way we approach it at RJMP, I think, is that we really value the case by case basis. So just really impacting sometimes one person at a time can make a big difference and can really help in terms of building reputation and having results, and just really focusing on the quality of services and the facilitators that you have. Rather than wanting to start big and not being able to meet that capacity, because a lot of things happen in the process, and it's really unpredictable. And even 4 years later, in dozens of cases, I would say every single one is different. So just being willing to look at it that way.
That's something that I think I'm really taking from you guys, is this individualized approach. That maybe as a society, when someone is harmed, instead of treating that like an assembly line where everybody lines up, gets their attorney, goes to court, and then they figure out and they hand down the exact same restitution pretty much every single time, even to the point of mandating it that you have to hand down this restitution every single time through mandatory minimum sentencing, that maybe there's a lot of hope for a more individualized approach to helping repair the harms that have been caused in the community. So how can, if people want your help, can they contact you? Do you guys kind of offer that kind of thing in setting up a new program? And if people want to help you in the work that you're doing in San Diego, how can they do that? We have listenership across the country, so what can they do to help?
I think even the simplest thing would be to learn about restorative justice, to learn about victim offender dialogue. You can volunteer as facilitators in different programs, and just be open to learning, and being open to that process, talking about it with people and especially if they're stakeholders and you have a friend that's an attorney and you can explain that to them. I think that's low level, the way that you could start doing that type of work.
You can always support us by donating at www.sdrjmp.org. And if you're an organization that needs help starting a program, we offer curriculum packages and training packages and consultation. And Xiani and her team can fly out and meet your team and take them through the process of what it takes to set up a program like this and what victim offender dialogue looks like. It's typically 20 to 30 hours of training, which incorporates some knowledge of the way the criminal justice system works in that specific region or municipality, and combining that with a mediation toolbox so that people understand how do I operate as a neutral, as a facilitator in cases like this, and what are the communication skills that you need, as well as really kind of what are those active listening skills that are particularly important when dealing with the aftermath of a crime or a harm against a person or relationship. So yeah, we offer that kind of training, and we're also just here. You can give us a call and ask us questions if you're thinking of starting a program, but you don't have funding yet, or you're just thinking of, what do I do? We'd be happy to help you. We get calls like that every week, and we're always trying to, encourage others to start programs like this. And we experience challenges here in our own county as well. So it's not like we live in a bubble here in San Diego County where everyone accepts RJ programs and it's, a prolific part of the criminal justice system. We experience some of the same challenges that any new organization might experience anywhere else. So.
And it's a collaborative process. I think one thing that we can support each other with as well is just connecting. And if you have a successful program, if you've done this in other parts of the country, we want to hear about it. We want to hear about the challenges and the success stories, and see how we can collectively improve those programs. And also, the most important part, I think, really is to gather some data as well. If we can all show that these programs are working, that these programs are an option, then we can have a complete package to show stakeholders in other parts of the country or in our own jurisdictions to be able to convince them to be more open.
And Xiani gives me the absolute perfect segue, which is, of course, you can, not only will we include links to RJMP and their resources in the show notes, but also if you want to see the case study and the data of how RGMP is impacting San Diego, you can download the Community Solutions Justice Report, which by the time this episode has been released, will be out and was released on October 10th at the Institute for Community Solutions website, which literally just put it into Google because the URL is way too long. Thank you guys so much for listening in to another wonderful episode. And of course, to kick off the Community Solutions to Justice series, lots more organizations coming your way, talking about various approaches to community justice in their communities. Stay tuned, and we'll see you next episode.
Thanks, Dan.